What's going on? I'm Nick LaGrange with 4 different things you can do in post-production to instantly improve your videos. Basically, these 4 different things I'm going to tell you about, pretty much anybody can do. You don't have to be a professional. You just have to be somebody with a camera who has a basic understanding of how shooting works and how post-production works. You can do this with any kind of program. I personally use Final Cut. Obviously, you can do it with Adobe Premiere. You can do it with any number of different kinds of non-linear editing software. So let's just get into it then. The first one is add movement. So whenever I'm shooting stuff, I try my best to add movement. It just makes your shots more dynamic, whether that's peeking around a corner when you're shooting at a house, or if it's your subject is stationary and you want to move around them, or it's having your subject actually move themselves. Either way, it's either the subject's got to move or you have to move around the subject. That movement has to be there, and sometimes we just forget to do that. When we're out shooting whatever we're shooting, we just forget that we have to have movement in most of the shots to keep things looking interesting. Sometimes you get in post, then you realize you just have a stationary shot where there should have been some movement to make it more of a dynamic shot, make it more of an interesting look. You can actually fix some of that in post. All right, so this is our shot here. This is a guy who's just showing a house and he's standing very stationary, no kind of movement whatsoever as he scrubbed through it here. You're not moving forward, not moving around him, anything like that, which, you know, for a talking head shot, sometimes that's fine, but if you want to make it just a little bit more interesting, you can actually add some movement to it here in post, here in Final Cut. So what you do is you highlight your clip, come over to transform, make sure that's checked right there. And then what you're gonna do is add a keyframe. That's this little button over here to the right next to scale. Add that, click that right at the beginning, and then scrub to the end, add another keyframe, same spot, and maybe we go, let's say like 120 or something like that. Maybe not 120, go down a little bit further, maybe 110. So then you click back to the front of the clip, hit the space bar, and there you can see some movement. We're doing a very slow push into him, just a little bit more of a dynamic shot there. You can do the same thing pulling back away from him. You just do the opposite of what I just did here. You would basically just start in real close at the front of the clip and then pull back out. Same kind of effect, just whatever your preference is there. You can actually do a pan kind of shot with it as well, where you're kind of moving the frame side to side. I don't suggest that. I don't think that looks nearly as good as it would if you just did a pan shot while you're shooting. So if you really want to get a panning shot of something with whatever your project is, I suggest doing that in camera, maybe not so much in post, but this is good. This zoom in and zoom out, that kind of dolly in, dolly out look works really well, and it's very easy to do. So after movement, then you want to add some sound depth to the movement as well, just to make it that much more dynamic. Some kind of whooshing sound always works, just anything that kind of reinforces that movement that you have in a shot. So in this project, you can see what I'm talking about with sound effects. I've got Steven's track here. He's talking throughout the entire clip. Down here, I've got the music track, and right in between, you can see there's 2 other types of audio tracks I put in here. This is just natural sound of being outside. You can hear birds chirping and that sort of thing. And then these are kind of the whooshes sounds, whooshing sounds, I don't know what's best to say there. As you move through, transition from one room to another, when I do speed ramps and that sort of thing. I'll play it back for you here so you can get a better idea of that without the track of Steven and without the music. So there you go, you just kind of figure out what kind of sound effects you want to put in there and just add them underneath the shots where it makes sense. You know, if you got a speed ramp, if you got a transition, put a whoosh sound in there. You can kind of elongate them a little bit if it's a little bit of a longer transition like that. Put the birds and the outdoor noise and all that stuff behind any kind of outdoor shots like this. I put it over the drone footage as well. It's really that simple, but it just adds that much more to your videos. And then keeping with the sound theme, then audio is very important. Like if you're doing an interview or if you're recording somebody's vows at a wedding or something like that, you want to make sure those audio levels stay within a certain range so that they're not peaking. If your audio levels start peaking, that's called overmodulation, and it just sounds very distorted and doesn't sound good, frankly, for a lack of a better term, and you don't want that. So there is a way to fix that in post as well with keyframing, just like we showed before. So let's do that now. All right, so this is what we're talking about here. If you look down here where we've got the audio track for Steven, let's zoom in a little bit here, give you a better look. You can see where the peaks and valleys are of the audio, and then you can see over on the right side here, as we play this back, you can see your levels. You always want to keep it below that 0, ideally somewhere in between -6 and 0 on that scale there. You don't ever want it to go in the red. You can get a little bit yellow, that kind of thing, but if it goes in the red, that means it's becoming over-modulated, and that's when you want to make adjustments. So if you look again on the audio track here, you can see some little kind of white dots that I've got on here. Those are actually keyframes of the audio. And these are spots where it did become a little bit over-modulated before. I added those keyframes to bring down the decibel a little bit. So the rest of this isn't over-modulated. I won't go back in time to redo this for you, but let's say that we want to focus in on this peak here. It's a little bit too loud for us. All we have to do is click on the audio track, come up to the audio icon here, and you're just going to click on the little keyframe icon to the right. If you hover over it, says add a keyframe, hit that button there, and then you see down here it leaves that little white keyframe for us. Then move the arrow over just 1 frame. That's all you need to do. Add another keyframe. From there, then we're going to drop this down from 12 to, let's say, 10. And that's going to bring that down just ever so slightly at that peak. Go a couple more frames over, however you want to adjust it here. You can go just 1 frame over, you go 2 or 3, whatever it's taking to get that peak to kind of really come down and not be over-modulated. You go to that point, hit another keyframe, scroll back over 1 more time, hit another keyframe, and then you can bring it back up to what it originally was, which was 12 here. So you've made an adjustment. You've added 4 keyframes around that little peak there, and then you're just moving on from there to keep everything balanced. So again, that's kind of what you want to do. You want to start with a keyframe that's going to hold in place what it originally was, add another keyframe right after that that brings it down slightly to wherever you need it to be, add another keyframe after that to hold that in place, and then 1 more keyframe just after that to bring it back up to where it originally was. And then last but not least is conforming your frame rates to 24 frames per second. There's something you need to know. Our human eyes can only see roughly 24 frames per second without some kind of strobe effect happening when we look at stuff. So when we're looking at videos, you want it to be in that same realm of 24 frames per second. A lot of cameras out there will shoot in much higher frame rates, like 30 frames a second, 60, 120, all the way up to I've seen some cameras shoot like 124,000 frames per second, which is just nuts. The reason those higher frame rates exist is because if you shoot in those and you have the right shutter speed going along with it, you can make really nice looking slow motion video with your camera. It's not really meant to be seen in real time. So since those higher frame rates aren't meant to be seen in real time, you really only need them when you're wanting to create a dream sequence like what I'm talking about, that slow motion, and you want that motion blur that goes along with it to look right. How do you achieve this? Well, you double your shutter speed from your frame rate. So if you're shooting 24 frames per second, you want your shutter speed to be 1/48th or 1/50th. If you're shooting with Sony cameras, sometimes they don't give you the exact option, but they get you pretty close. If you're shooting 60 frames a second, you want your shutter speed to be 120. If you are shooting 120 frames per second, you want it to be 240, and so on and so on. That's how you get the right motion blur and make sure it's not looking too jumpy or anything like that. And this is what I'm talking about here. I've got 2 different clips. You can see this first one, if we highlight it and look up here in the top right corner, it shows 29.97 frames per second, which is roughly 30 frames a second. And then this other one I've got next to it, if we highlight that, it says 60 frames per second, which is what that is. We play these back. You can see this first one of this house, 30 frames a second. Doesn't look too bad there, and actually 30 frames a second is standard for a lot of television shows, sitcoms, and that sort of thing. So 30 frames a second doesn't look too crazy. I'll show you how to slow it down here in a minute. This one is a clip of a guy dancing, 60 frames a second, and it looks like he's kind of warping time and space almost. You're losing information. That's why it looks so crazy. Your eye can't quite catch up to 60 frames a second because, like I said, you can only see roughly 24 frames a second. That's why you have kind of that strobe effect where it looks like things are a little bit out of place. Your eye is not catching all the frames that the camera caught, so it just looks weird. How do we address this then? I talked about slowing it down. If you come over to this one here, this is 30 frames a second. So 30 frames down to 24 means that we are going to make this 80%. We make that 80% because if you divide 24 over 30, that is 80%. That gets us to that confirmation of 24 frames a second. So if we play that back, It actually looks really, really smooth. We did the right kind of motion blur for it when we shot this in the first place with the drone. Making sure you've got the right shutter speed to go along with the frame rate you're shooting in, which of course was 30. Slow that down and it looks a lot better. Now with this one, it's 60 frames a second. So if you take 24 divided by 60, you get 0.4, which is 40%. So Command R, that's how we pull this up. Click the arrow, go to custom, and you're just gonna type in 40%. And if we play that back, much, much smoother. Our eyes can actually catch up to all those frames because we've slowed it down to 24 frames a second. He no longer looks like some kind of magician or wizard. He's not looking abnormal at all. This is what we want. We want it to look smooth so it's not looking chaotic unless that's the style you're actually going for. Obviously there's stylistic approaches to this. The one that's brought up most often is Saving Private Ryan, where there's a lot of running and it's a very jarring sequence here and there where there's bullets flying and it's a war scene. So stylistically, the people who shot that movie, they just shot very high frame rates and then just let it run in real time because it's supposed to look stroby and it's supposed to look chaotic and that kind of thing. So if you are going for that sort of thing, then by all means, go for it. But rule of thumb, always conform back to 24 frames per second, no matter what your frame rate was when you were shooting. So those are my 4 tips for you today. You can control 2 of them, at least while you're shooting. That's movement and making sure your audio levels are right, so you don't have to fix those in post. You can. And then the other 2 are add sound effects and conform your frame rates back to 24 frames per second when you are in post as well. If you just keep those 4 things in mind, even if you're a novice shooting video, you're gonna be way ahead of so many people out there. If you like this video, like, subscribe below, leave a comment. Maybe there's something else you want to teach me, or maybe you want to discuss more about this. If you have more questions about what I've talked about, I'd be happy to answer those for you. And we'll see you in the next one.